It was a warm Saturday morning, the kind where the air was soft, the sun was bright, and the whole neighborhood felt unusually peaceful. Birds chirped on telephone wires, sprinklers ticked lazily across green lawns, and kids' laughter echoed. From somewhere down the street, the quiet little suburb looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. People here trusted each other. They waved to their neighbors, shared sugar when needed, and argued only about minor things, like whose hedge had grown over the property line. But lately, there had been tension in the air, something invisible but heavy. The Homeowners Association had recently decided to increase security after a couple of small incidents. A garden gnome went missing from Mrs. Peterson's yard, and a teenager's bike was stolen from his driveway. To most people, it wasn't a big deal. These things happened anywhere. But the HOA president, Mr. Howard, believed the neighborhood was under threat. So, without much discussion, they hired a private security guard to patrol the streets. His name was Richard Blake. But around the neighborhood, some jokingly called him HOA cop because of how seriously he took himself. Richard wasn't a police officer. He had no formal training beyond a basic security certification course. But he wore a dark uniform with a shiny badge, carried a radio, and most alarmingly wore a gun on his belt, like he was preparing for a war zone instead of guarding quiet streets. Richard liked to think of himself as the hero in a small town. Western, the lone sheriff keeping troublemakers away. He didn't understand that this wasn't a movie, and that the way he acted could be dangerous. That Saturday morning, Emily Carter had just come home from an early workout at the gym. Emily wasn't like most people her age. At 31, she had already served 12 years in the United States Navy, 9 of them as part of the elite Navy SEALs. She had been deployed in some of the most dangerous regions in the world, had trained for every kind of combat, survived life-or-death missions, and seen things most people couldn't imagine. But outside of the military, she kept a low profile. She didn't walk around bragging about her service. In fact, most people in the neighborhood didn't even know what she did for a living. To them, she was just Emily, the Carter's daughter. Visiting her parents for a few weeks between assignments, she parked her black pickup truck in the driveway, stepped out in her workout gear, and grabbed a bag of groceries from the passenger seat. She had picked up some milk, eggs, and bread. For her mom on the way back, as she walked toward the front door, she noticed a figure across the street. Richard, standing by his golf cart, arms crossed, eyes locked on her. Emily ignored him. She was used to people watching her. Years in the military had taught her that awareness wasn't a threat by itself. But the way Richard stared wasn't casual, it was sharp, like he was already suspicious. She reached the door, unlocked it, and stepped inside to drop the groceries on the kitchen counter. Her mom was upstairs, probably still getting ready for the day, and her dad was out running errands. Emily grabbed a water bottle and stepped back outside to grab a second bag from her truck. That's when it happened. Richard crossed the street quickly, his boots heavy on the pavement. "Excuse me?" he called, his voice sharp, almost like a command. Emily turned her head slightly but didn't answer. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, especially not with someone who clearly had an attitude. "I said excuse me," Richard repeated, now just a few steps away. Emily finally faced him. "Yes," she said calmly, her tone neutral. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Do you live here?" Emily raised an eyebrow.
Das.
"My parents own this house." He didn't look convinced. "Can you prove that?" Emily let out a short breath, half amusement, half irritation. "I don't need to prove where I live. I told you this is my family's home." Richard's hand rested on his hip, just inches. From his holster, "We've had reports of suspicious activity. I'm going to need to see some identification." Emily didn't move. She wasn't about to fumble through her pockets because some overzealous HOA security guard thought he was a detective. "You're not a police officer," she reminded him. "You have no authority to demand my ID." Something about her calm tones seemed to bother him. His jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm responsible for the safety of this community," he said, puffing his chest. "And right now, I don't know who you are." Emily tilted her head slightly, watching him. Mind, she was already assessing the situation the way she had been trained: distance, posture, tension, possible threat level. She saw the way his right hand kept hovering near his weapon, how his stance shifted like he wanted to assert dominance. She also noticed his breathing quicker than normal. That could mean adrenaline, fear, or anger. "I think you're overreacting," Emily said, her voice still calm but now a little firmer. "I'm not a threat to anyone. I'm going to finish unloading my groceries now." She turned to grab the last bag from her truck. That's when she heard a sharp, metallic sound. She turned back and froze. Richard had drawn his gun. Morning air suddenly felt heavier. A mother walking her dog across the street stopped in her tracks. A kid on a bicycle slowed to a near stop, staring wide-eyed. Emily's eyes locked on the weapon, but she didn't flinch. Years of training had taught her that fear only gave power to the other person. "Put the bag down," Richard ordered, his voice shaking slightly but still loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear. "Step away from the vehicle." Emily set the grocery bag on the hood of the truck and raised her hands slightly. Palms out, not in surrender, but in a way that told him she wasn't going to make a sudden move. "Why are you pointing a gun at me?" she asked evenly. "I told you we've had suspicious activity. You could be trespassing, you could be dangerous," Richard snapped. Emily's eyes didn't leave his. "Or maybe you're pointing a loaded gun at a resident in her own driveway because you made a bad assumption?" Her voice was steady, her gaze unshaken. She was deliberately slowing the pace, giving herself time to think, and him time to reconsider. But Richard seemed locked in his own world, convinced he was in control. Inside, Emily was calculating. The distance between them was about 9 feet. His stance was sloppy. His finger placement on the trigger was tense bad form. She could disarm him in under 2 seconds if she needed to. But there were neighbors watching, and she knew that any physical move might escalate things before they could be diffused. She decided on patience. "You're making a mistake," she said softly. Richard didn't respond immediately, his eyes darting to the small crowd forming at the edge of the sidewalk. People were pulling out phones. Some were whispering. Still, his pride seemed to keep him from lowering the weapon. Emily thought of her parents inside the house, of her mom coming to the door and seeing this scene. She wasn't going to let things spiral any further than they already had. But at that moment, she also knew something. Richard didn't. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and that ignorance was about to change everything. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The street seemed frozen in time, the only sound coming from the faint rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. Emily kept her eyes fixed on Richard's face, not the gun, because she knew the weapon was only as dangerous as the man holding its hand. The man in front of her was already showing cracks in his control. His stance was off, his weight shifting from one foot to the other, sure sign that adrenaline was making him unstable. Across the street, the small group of neighbors had grown. 2 more people had stepped out onto their porches. Someone whispered, "Call the cops." Another voice said, "I'm recording this." A teenage boy with a skateboard stopped dead in his tracks, phone held up like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Emily felt the warm sun on her face, the uneven pavement under her shoes, the heaviness of the situation pressing in from all sides. This wasn't a war zone. This was a quiet neighborhood street. But the tension in the air felt exactly like those moments before a firefight. Overseas, when you could almost hear the ticking of the clock inside your own head. "Step away from the vehicle," Richard repeated, his voice louder this time. Emily didn't move. "I told you. I live here. My parents are inside right now. You're pointing a loaded weapon at an innocent person." His grip tightened. "It's for me to decide." That choice of words told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about protecting the neighborhood anymore. It was about his ego. He had backed himself into a corner and didn't know how to back out without losing face. Emily took a slow, careful breath. "If you really believe I'm a threat, then call the police. But right now, you're making this dangerous for everyone, including yourself." Richard's eyes flickered toward the group of onlookers again, a longer. This went on, the more attention it was drawing. His face was red now, sweat glistening on his forehead. The sun was hot. She could tell it wasn't just the heat. It was the pressure of the moment. A woman in a pink bathrobe shouted from her porch, "Put the gun down, Richard. She's Carter's daughter." Emily could see the uncertainty flash across his face, but his pride didn't let him back down. Instead, he barked, "Everyone stay back. This is official security business." Emily almost laughed at that, official security business. She had been on missions in enemy territory where her life depended on every decision she made. And here was a man in a pressed uniform from a private security firm pretending to be the sheriff of a gated neighborhood. But she didn't laugh. She knew how fragile this moment was. "You've got a crowd watching," Emily said in a calm, even voice. "They're filming. Think about what this is going to look like when the real police arrive." Richard's jaw worked as if he wanted to say something, but he hesitated. The pause was dangerous. It meant he was in his head, not fully in control of his actions. Emily shifted her weight slightly. Not enough to be threatening, but enough to be ready. Every muscle in her body was alert. Years of training had built her reflexes to respond faster than thought itself. She could hear the faint rustle of a car pulling up somewhere down the street, maybe a neighbor returning home. Then she heard her mom's voice. "Emily." It came from the doorway behind her. Emily's heart clenched on out of fear, but because she didn't want her mother seeing this. "Stay inside, Mom," she called over her shoulder without looking away from Richard. Her mother stepped forward anyway, worry in her eyes. "What is going on here?" Richard snapped. "Ma'am, please stay back." His gun was still pointed at Emily, but his voice had shifted to a higher pitch now, like he was losing control of the situation. Emily could see the sweat trickling down from his temple, his finger resting too close to the trigger. The danger here wasn't that he would intentionally shoot her. She could see in his eyes he wasn't planning that, but that his nerves might make him slip. "Mom, go back." "Inside," Emily said firmly, her voice edged with the kind of authority she had used in the field. Her mother froze, then slowly stepped back into the house, leaving the door half open. Now it was just Emily, Richard, and the neighbor's stairs. "Let's end this," Emily said quietly. "You put your gun away? We talk like reasonable people, and nobody gets hurt." Richard shook his head. "You don't tell me what to do?" In her mind, Emily almost sighed. This was the problem with people like him. They believed authority was about barking orders, not about protecting people. The worst part was, he thought he was still in control. She decided to shift tactics. Instead of trying to convince him she was harmless, she started asking questions. It's something she'd been trained to do to unsettle an opponent. "What's your plan here, Richard?" she asked evenly. "You're standing in front of half the neighborhood with a gun pointed at someone who hasn't moved toward you once. When the cops show up, what are you going to tell them? That you threatened a resident because she was carrying groceries?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll tell them you were suspicious." "When they ask what made me suspicious," she pressed, "you going to say I looked fit? That I was unloading my own truck? Or that I didn't back down when you started throwing your weight around?" His eyes darted again to the crowd. More phones were up now, and Lee could almost feel the shift happening. His confidence was leaking away. But she had to be careful. A man who feels his pride slipping away can do something reckless. She kept her voice calm, steady, and low enough that it felt like they were having a private conversation, even though everyone could hear. "You don't have to do this. Nobody's going to think less of you if you just walk away. But if you keep that gun pointed at me for another minute, you're going to regret it." The words weren't a threat. They were a fact spoken with. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly how a situation will end. For the first time since he'd approached her, Richard looked unsure. His stance loosened, his eyes flicked toward his holster as if considering putting the weapon away. But then, from somewhere down the street, a faint wail of a police siren began to rise. Emily didn't move, but inside, she was counting. Sirens meant the real law was on its way. She just had to hold this line a little longer without anyone making a stupid move. The siren grew louder. Richard's face shifted from anger to something closer to panic. He looked over his shoulder at the approaching noise, then back at Emily, then at the crowd. He had seconds to decide how this would end for him. And in those seconds, Emily knew this wasn't over yet. The sound of the siren was growing louder, its wail cutting through the tense air like a warning bell. Neighbors shifted nervously, their eyes darting between Emily and Richard. Some whispered to each other, their voices carrying in the still morning air. The cameras on their phones kept recording, tiny black lenses capturing every second of this strange and dangerous standoff. Emily's mind was crystal clear. Her breathing was slow, steady, and her heartbeat was under control. She'd been in situations far worse than this, in dark alleys, in foreign countries, in buildings where every door could hide an enemy. Compared to those, this was almost predictable. The difference was, in those moments, everyone involved knew the rules of engagement. Here she was dealing with a man who thought he was in control, but had no idea how far out of his depth he really was. Richard's hands were slick with sweat now. She could see the faint tremor in his right arm, the one holding the gun. His eyes kept darting toward the street corner where the siren was coming from, then back to her, then to the crowd. He was cornered by his own decisions, and she knew that if she didn't take control now, something stupid could happen before the police even arrived. Her voice came out low and calm. "Richard, this ends now." He shook his head slightly, like he wanted to hold on to whatever authority he thought he had left. "Stay where you are." "I am staying where I am," she replied evenly. "You've got a gun pointed at me. I'm not moving towards you. But here's the thing, you're not going to fire that weapon. You know it, I know it, and everyone here knows it. Which means the only thing left to do is put it away before you humiliate yourself even further." Her tone wasn't mocking. It was matter of fact. It was the same tone she'd used in training when dealing with nervous recruits who were seconds. Away from making a dangerous mistake, he took a small step closer. It was exactly what she was waiting for. In her head, she counted 1, 2, 3. And then she moved. To the untrained eye, it looked like a blur. But every motion was precise, calculated and controlled. Her left hand came up and caught his wrist just below the gun, twisting it outward and away from her body at an exact angle that forced his grip to loosen without giving him time to react. At the same time, she stepped forward into his space, her right hand sliding over the top of the weapon to control the barrel. Richard let out a short, shocked grunt, his eyes going wide. He tried to pull back, but her grip was like steel. Years of combat training meant her muscles moved without hesitation. In less than 2 seconds, she had rotated his wrist just far enough for the gun to drop harmlessly into her other hand. The crowd gasped. A phone tilted downward as its owner forgot about filming for a moment. Emily took 3 smooth steps back. The gun now pointed safely toward the ground, her finger nowhere near the trigger. She didn't need to threaten him. She already had complete control. Richard stumbled slightly, his hands now empty, his authority gone in an instant. His face went pale, the shock settling in. "How did you?" "I told you this wasn't going to end the way you thought," Emily said calmly. The siren was almost on top of them now. A black and white patrol car rounded the corner, lights flashing, pulling to a stop just feet away. 2 officers jumped out, hands resting near their holsters as they took in the scene. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded. Emily didn't take her eyes off Richard as she replied. "Private security officer pointed a loaded gun at me without cause. I disarmed him for everyone's safety." One of the neighbors, Mrs. Peterson, stepped forward, her phone still recording. "She's telling the truth. We all saw it. We had that gun in her face for no reason." The taller officer moved toward Richard. "Is that true?" Richard opened his mouth but closed it again, his eyes darting between the officers, the crowd, and Emily. His lips moved like he wanted to deny it. But the sight of at least a dozen phones pointed at him seemed to crush whatever defense he was about to make. Emily, still holding the gun, pointed toward the ground, walked over to the nearest officer, and offered it grip first. "Weapon is safe. Finger off the trigger. No harm done yet." The officer took it carefully, glancing from her to Richard. "Who exactly are you?" "Emily Carter," she said. "This is my parents' home. I'm visiting for a few weeks." The other officer stepped in. "How'd you manage to take the gun from him so fast?" Emily gave a small shrug. 12 years in the Navy, 9 as a SEAL. Let's just say I've dealt with more dangerous situations. That got a reaction from the crowd. Several people gasped or murmured to each other. Someone whispered, She's a Navy SEAL. In disbelief, Richard's face flushed deep red now, not from the heat, but from the humiliation. His jaw clenched, and he looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. The officers exchanged a glance that said they understood exactly what had just happened here. The taller one looked at Richard. "You're lucky she's trained. Otherwise, this could have gone very badly for you." Emily stepped back, letting the officers handle it. She didn't want to drag this out any longer. She wasn't here for revenge, just to make sure no one got hurt. The officer asked if she wanted to file a complaint. She looked at Richard for a long moment. "Not today," she said finally. "But I do want the HOA to know that hiring someone who doesn't understand proper use of force is putting this whole community at risk." She could feel every eye on her as she turned toward her house. Her mother was standing at the door again, worry mixed with pride on her face. Before going inside, Emily paused and looked back at Richard. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the street. "Next time you point a gun at someone, make sure you know who you're dealing with. And make sure you're ready for what comes after." Then she walked inside, closing the door behind her, leaving Richard standing in the street surrounded by neighbors, 2 police officers, and the sound of his own pride collapsing. The entire exchange had lasted less than 5 minutes from the moment she took the gun, but to everyone watching, it felt like they'd just witnessed something out of a movie. What they didn't know was that Emily had held back. She could have taken him down in a dozen different ways, but she'd chosen the one that left everyone standing and the neighborhood intact. In her mind, that was the real victory, not the disarm, not the reveal of who she was, but the fact that no one's life had been destroyed in those tense minutes. And that, she thought, was something this so-called HOA cop might never understand. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. The same houses stood in the same neat rows, the same trees lined the sidewalks, and the same sprinklers clicked across lawns. But the air was thick with whispers. People were no longer talking about missing garden gnomes or overgrown hedges. They were talking about Emily Carter, the quiet daughter who had grown up on this street, left for the Navy, and come back for a short visit, only to end up disarming the HOA's private security officer in front of half the neighborhood. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee when her phone buzzed with a text from her childhood friend, Katie, who lived 3 houses down. "You're all over Facebook. Video's been shared like 200 times already." Emily sighed. She hadn't wanted attention. I hadn't even told most of her friends about her service in the Navy SEALs. That wasn't who she was. She'd never believed in bragging about her training. But yesterday's incident had ripped that privacy away. Now, it seemed like everyone knew. Her mom came in from the front porch carrying the morning mail. "It's like a parade out there," she said with a hint of amusement. "People slowing down as they walk by, trying to get a look at you." Emily shook her head. "I'm not interested in being the neighborhood celebrity, Mom." "Too late for that," her mom replied. She set the mail on the counter and lowered her voice. "The HOA president came by earlier. Left a note saying they want to discuss the incident." Emily rolled her eyes. "Discuss? Or find a way to make it seem like their guy wasn't completely out of line?" Her mom shrugged. "Probably both." By mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. When Emily opened it, she found 2 men standing there, one she recognized as Mr. Howard, the HOA president, and the other she guessed was the HOA's lawyer. Both wore polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Miss Carter?" Mr. Howard began, his voice smooth but stiff. "We'd like to talk to you about what happened yesterday." Emily stepped aside, letting them into the living room. She stayed standing while they sat down. Subtle reminder that she wasn't settling in for a long, cozy conversation. "First of all," the lawyer began, "we want to assure you that the HOA takes safety very seriously." Emily crossed her arms. "If you took safety seriously, you wouldn't have hired a man with no real law enforcement training and given him a loaded weapon to patrol a quiet neighborhood." The lawyer cleared his throat. "While it's true, Mr. Blake, you mean Richard?" Emily cut in. "Let's use his name. This isn't an abstract situation. A man named Richard pointed a gun at me in my own driveway." "Oh, wait." Mr. Howard shifted uncomfortably. We understand your frustration, but perhaps we can all agree that tensions ran high, and there may have been misunderstandings. Millie stared at him for a moment, then spoke slowly. A misunderstanding is if someone waves at me and I think they're trying to flag me down. Misunderstanding is mixing up a meeting time. Pointing a loaded gun at someone's chest for unloading groceries is not a misunderstanding. It's a dangerous misuse of force. The lawyer tried to redirect. Miss Carter, the HOA would prefer to resolve this quietly. Emily raised an eyebrow. Quietly. Is that because you're worried about the safety of residents, or because you're worried about your reputation? Neither man answered right away. I told her everything. Finally, Mr. Howard said, "We'd like to offer you an assurance that Mr. Blake will be placed on temporary leave while we review his conduct." Emily almost laughed. Temporary leave? That's your idea of accountability? What happens when he comes back and decides to draw his gun on someone else? What if it's a teenager next time? Or a delivery driver? The lawyer's tone grew sharper. What exactly would you like the HOA to do, Miss Carter? Emily didn't hesitate. Remove him from the position permanently. And stop hiring private security officers who carry firearms unless they have actual law enforcement or military experience. The two men exchanged a look. She could see them weighing their options, probably wondering if she'd take this public. If they refused, she decided to make it clear. If you don't take those steps, I'll be happy to give a full statement to the local news outlets that have already contacted me, she said evenly. And I'll make sure every resident in this neighborhood knows exactly what happened and how you responded. Mr. Howard's smile tightened. We'll take your recommendations under advisement. Molly nodded toward the door. Good, let me know when you've made your decision. They stood, thanked her for her time, left without making eye contact. By that afternoon, the video of the disarm had hit over 1,000 shares online. Strangers were commenting, praising her for her calm and skill. A few called her a hero. Others criticized the HOA for putting an armed man in a quiet neighborhood. The police had also called. An officer she'd spoken to the day before told her that Richard's gun had been fully loaded, safety off. If you hadn't known what you were doing, he said, that could have ended a lot worse. Emily knew he was right. That's what kept her from just brushing this off. Meanwhile, Richard had gone silent. No one had seen him since yesterday. His golf cart sat unused by the HOA office, and his name was removed from the weekly security schedule posted online. Rumor had it he'd been suspended without pay while the board figured out what to do next. Some neighbors avoided bringing it up when they saw Emily, offering only polite nods or small talk about the weather. Others came right out with their opinions. Good for you, said Mr. Reynolds from across the street. That man's been itching for trouble since he started. You saved us all from a disaster, Mrs. Peterson told her one afternoon. I've been nervous about him since the first day he patrolled with that gun, but not everyone was supportive. A woman named Diane, who was close friends with Mr. Howard, cornered Emily outside the grocery store. I think you embarrassed the HOA on purpose, she accused. Richard was just trying to do his job. Emily kept her voice calm. If pointing a loaded gun at someone who lives here is his job, then the job is the problem. By the end of the week, the HOA sent out an official notice to all residents. The message was short and carefully worded, saying that recent events had prompted a review of the neighborhood's security policies. Effective immediately, all armed patrols were suspended pending further evaluation. It didn't name Emily. It didn't name Richard, but everyone knew. For Emily, the real victory wasn't the online attention or the whispers in the neighborhood. It was knowing that, for now, no one else would have to walk down their own driveway with a gun pointed at them by a man who mistook suspicion for authority. But deep down, she also knew that people like Richard and organizations like the HOA didn't change overnight. Pride and power had a way of twisting the truth, which meant this story wasn't over yet. The days that followed felt calmer, almost like the neighborhood was slowly exhaling after holding its breath for too long. There were no more patrols of a man in dark sunglasses cruising slowly past driveways with his hand near his hip. No one felt the sudden weight of suspicion from a stranger who lived among them. For the first time in months, people walked their dogs without glancing over their shoulders. Kids rode bikes without parents keeping one nervous eye on the street. Emily noticed the change immediately. It wasn't just about safety. It was about the feeling of belonging again, tension that had been quietly building before the gun. Incident had lifted, replaced by something warmer, more connected. But her role in that shift hadn't gone away. If anything, it had deepened. Everywhere she went in the neighborhood, someone stopped her. A man she barely knew waved from his porch and called out, "Glad you were here when you were." An elderly woman from the end of the street brought over a plate of cookies as thanks, saying, "You didn't just protect yourself. You protected all of us." Emily appreciated the kindness, but she didn't let it change her. She knew how easy it was for a single dramatic event to make someone a temporary hero in the eyes of others. What mattered more was whether the community actually learned from it and whether real change followed. A week later, the HOA called a special meeting at the community hall. Flyers had been slipped into every mailbox, announcing the agenda, security policy review, and resident feedback. Emily wasn't sure she wanted to go. Part of her felt that her job was done. She'd stopped a dangerous moment before it turned deadly, but another part of her knew that people like Mr. Howard could twist a story if the person at the center of it didn't speak for themselves, so she went. The hall was nearly full when she walked in. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the HOA board sat with their papers neatly stacked. Mr. Howard sat in the middle, flanked by other board members. He spotted Emily and gave a small, polite nod, the kind of gesture that said, "We're not enemies, but I still wish you weren't here." The meeting began with the usual formalities, but everyone was waiting for the security discussion. When they finally got to it, Mr. Howard cleared his throat and spoke in a tone that tried to balance authority with humility. "Recent events," he said, "have reminded us of the need to ensure both safety and trust in our community. The board has decided to make several changes to our security policies." He listed them: no armed patrols unless required by verified law enforcement, stricter background checks for any future hires, and a new neighborhood watch program made up of volunteer residents. There was a low murmur of approval from the crowd. Then, to Emily's surprise, Mr. Howard turned to her. "Miss Carter, since you were directly involved in the incident that prompted this review, would you like to share your perspective?" Every head in the room turned toward her. Emily stood slowly, feeling the weight of the attention but also the responsibility of the moment. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," she began, her voice steady. "I'm here because what happened to me could have happened to anyone in this room. A person who wasn't trained, who didn't know how to react under pressure, might not be standing here right now. Can't afford to take that risk in our own neighborhood." She told them plainly what she thought, that real safety came from knowing your neighbors, from trust. From communication, not from arming someone with a weapon they didn't fully understand how to use. She explained that in her career, carrying a gun wasn't just about having the right equipment. It was about the training, the discipline, the judgment to use it only when absolutely necessary. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment, then a wave of nods and a few soft claps broke the silence. After the meeting, several people came up to her, thanking her again, not just for what she'd done that day, but for speaking out. Even Mr. Howard shook her hand, though he still wore that guarded expression. By the next morning, the HOA sent out an email to all residents confirming the changes. Richard would not be returning to his role, and future security measures would focus on unarmed, community-based patrols. It felt like closure in the days that followed. Emily went back to her routines, morning runs, coffee with her mom helping. Her dad fixed the fence in the backyard. The whispers about what happened began to fade, replaced by the normal rhythm of suburban life. But the lesson lingered. Not just for the HOA, but for the people who had witnessed that moment. Neighbors who barely knew each other before now waved more often. A group of residents even started an evening walking club, partly for fitness, partly as a way to keep an eye on the neighborhood together. One evening, as Emily was sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Mr. Reynolds from across the street came over. He leaned on the railing, his voice low. "You know, Emily, I've lived here 20 years. I've seen the HOA get it wrong more times than I can count, but I've never seen them change this fast. That's because of you." Emily smiled faintly. "It's not because of me. It's because they didn't want to end up on the evening news again," he chuckled. "Maybe so, but still you gave them the push they needed." The night before she was scheduled to leave town and return to her military duties, there was another knock at the door. When she opened it, she found a small group of neighbors standing there, some holding baked goods, one with a thank you card signed by dozens of residents. "We just wanted to say goodbye," Mrs. Peterson said. "And thank you, one more time." Emily accepted the card and the cookies, touched by the gesture. She didn't need their thanks. She'd done what anyone should do when faced with danger. But it meant something to know they understood. The next morning, as she loaded her bags into her truck, she looked around at the quiet street one last time. It wasn't perfect. No neighborhood was. But it was better than it had been before that day. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a problem came up, the people here would handle it with more sense and less fear. As she drove away, she thought about Richard, not with anger, but with a kind of detached pity. She hoped he'd learned something too, because the truth was, in moments of crisis, authority isn't about who has the loudest voice or the biggest weapon. It's about who can stay calm, think clearly, and protect the people around them. And that, Emily knew, was the kind of authority worth respecting.